during nights when the restraints cut most painfully into my wrists and legs, or when my stomach writhed and twisted like a tormented snake, I allowed myself to drift off into my only happy memory. I was 3 or 4 years old, and I was with my best friend. At that age, children don't really form visual memories, and so my only impression of her is warmth and happiness. I can't tell you the color of her eyes or her hair, but I know that we were inseparable and that I loved her. And there's no way to be sure of this, but I like to believe we were at a birthday party, either mine or hers, because there is a sweet taste in my mouth, and from my painfully limited knowledge of these things, it was the taste of cake. And when I thought about my only friend, the scuffed walls around me faded away and the pain in my joints became unimportant enough to ignore, at least temporarily. I know for sure that this memory takes place before my 5th birthday, which is much more clear in my mind. And that was the day I began to know something of my situation. "Happy birthday," my mother said, glancing up briefly into my face. Her eyes were cold and distant. She was crouched in front of me and checking my restraints, and as she spoke, she tightened them with a vicious tug. And then she stood up and left my room without a backwards glance. I remembered sobbing at the door locked behind her, crying for her and my father, or anyone really, just to come back. I was so young. I didn't yet understand that the people who called themselves my parents were monsters. It took 12 years before things changed, and by that point, I had almost given up. By the age of 8, I knew that not only did my parents not love me, but that they despised me. Childhood innocence and blind trust gave way to silliness, and then to anger and outright rebellion. I would rip at my restraints until I'd gouged bloody semicircles in my skin. I spat and swore at my parents as they stabbed me with needles and injected vileness into my veins. I screamed until my throat stung and my voice gave out. My struggles fell on deaf ears. They simply ignored me. They kept injecting the stuff that made me feel curiously dull and caused a heavy weight to settle in my stomach. Once, out of sheer frustration at his refusal to listen to my pleas, I tried to bite my father as he readied the syringe. He reared back and he punched me so hard in the face that my head bounced back against the wall. I woke up with a splitting headache, and my vision partially obscured with gauze. My father was hunched in the corner, staring at me. The look in his eyes made me shudder. I called out to him, but my mouth wouldn't open. They had wired my jaw shut. That contraption stayed on for a year, night and day, combined with more restraints. It didn't matter that I couldn't eat or drink. That was all taken care of, thanks to the miserable sludge injected into my veins 3 times a day. I grew accustomed to the gag and not being able to speak, and when they had finally taken it off, I didn't even care. Things changed because of my dad. He and my mother were an odd couple. She was small and intense. He was large and morose. I always had the impression, even though he had hit me, that he was somewhat kinder, if you could even apply such adjectives to people like my parents. I heard his raised voice one day over the drone of my small TV. I had awoken to find it in my room, not long after the gag had been put on. A remote control lay by my fingers. It must have been a gift from my dad, a sort of apology, because I know Mom wouldn't approve of it. It's stupid to put ideas in her head. I heard her mutter to herself the first time she saw it. And Dad showed me how to operate the remote. The TV was old and only showed 3 channels: a cooking show, a news report, and a colorful cartoon. But by that point, I was so drained and broken that I could barely focus on the flickering images. I preferred to gaze at the static, my ears numbed by the hissing and my mind's eye conjuring up endless snow. A snowy field where my friend and I rolled and jumped and played together. I could almost feel the cold flakes on my skin when Dad's voice cut through the static and jerked me into wakefulness. And all the time that I'd known him, he had never raised his voice. But now I could hear her shouting faintly through the heavy door. "I won't allow you to do it to her. No, she's already suffered enough." Mom's reply was too faint to hear. I don't care. What sort of life are we giving her anyway? Again, there came a pause, and then Dad spoke again, his voice quieter and choked with bitterness. I strained to hear him clearly. You've done enough to her already. I suppose you may as well kill her and get it over with. Silence, and then a crash. A door slammed somewhere in the recesses of the house I'd never seen. My heart thudded painfully. My torture had become mundane to them. I wasn't dying quickly enough. With the knowledge that they were going to kill me, my will to live came surging back. Later that day, Dad came into the room to give me dinner. I looked directly into his eyes and I forced my lips into a smile. He paused in the entryway and gave a small smile in return. I allowed myself to feel the slightest amount of hope. Hey Dad, what's up? The words came out more harshly than I'd intended. I hadn't spoken for over a year. He began to slide the needle into my forearm. It's nice to hear your voice again, he said as he depressed the plunger. I know I've been difficult for you and Mom, and I'm sorry. I said quickly, trying to keep at bay the horrible dullness that always came after the injection. I'm going to try and be better, to be a better daughter from now on. Dad got up with a grunt and gazed down at me. You're just very sick, Laura. Your mom and I are working very hard to cure you, he said mechanically. And the good lies to justify their torture, and that somehow I needed to be tied down and abused like an animal in order to cure a sickness I didn't have. One time as a young girl, I had pleaded with my mother to tell me the name of my disease. She laughed humorously at me, and then she said, You don't want to know, and then swept out of my room, carrying aloft my reeking bedpan. Please don't kill me. And the words spilled out along with my tears, and now I wasn't faking it. I don't want to die, please. He stared at me. That same old look tempered with something else. Was it pity? Anger? Finally he spoke and his voice was raw. I don't want you to die, but your mother. He stopped abruptly and then shook his head. I'm sorry, love. He laughed and I was alone with my despair. But in the middle of the night, he came back. I had sobbed until the numbness returned and my mind was blank, empty of all thoughts, even those of my friend. At some point, I fell asleep, because something compelled me to open my eyes. The room was black, but I could make out a darker, bulky shape in the corner, breathing heavily. Dad? I whispered. You've never had real food before. It was a statement, not a question. Both of us knew it. No. He was holding something in a bowl, his hands trembling. I could smell it. It smelled like nothing I'd ever known before, but instinctively, I knew it was good and right to eat. I thought of the blonde host on the cooking shows on TV, slicing tomatoes and braising beef in a cast iron skillet. My mouth watered. Tomorrow might be your last day, and I don't think it's fair that you never... He paused to swallow and then continued in a fierce whisper. That you've never been able to eat. My jaw ached with need. Dad put the bowl down on the floor in front of me and then he stepped back. I was glad that I couldn't see his face in that moment. Does Mom know? No. My arms were restrained, but it didn't matter. I ate his head I'd never eaten before in my life, and I licked the bowl clean. Dad stayed until I was finished. I knew he was crying from the shaking sounds of his breathing. He said nothing else, only took the empty bowl and shuffled away. Mom found out the next day. She came in the morning to draw my blood and froze in the doorway. And then she backed out of my room, still staring, and pulled the door shut. I heard her screaming for my father. I licked at the corner of my mouth and I listened. What have you done? I have never heard so much rage in my mother's voice. She knows, Alice. She's not stupid. Besides, it was only from the butcher. I didn't. There's a chance it could have worked. And now you've gone and... I began to inspect the thick straps encircling my arms and legs and chest. I hadn't received my injection yet, and that coupled with my first meal left me unusually alert. I was able to work my fingers under one of the restraints on my arm and began searching up and down for any weaknesses. The door burst open, startling me. Mom stood there, panting heavily. Her hair was in disarray and her eyes were bloodshot. She closed the door behind her and locked her from the inside. In her hand was a syringe, larger than normal, filled with a milky liquid. "What did your dad tell you?" she demanded. I looked back at her silently. For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. "There is a chance that this could really help you," she continued, gesturing with the syringe. "It's dangerous, yes, but if it works, you'll be able to live a more normal life. Although now that your father has gone and fed you, it might not be as effective." She fell silent for a moment, deep in thought. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, and tears shimmered in her eyes. I looked away, repulsed by this parody of tenderness. "Laura, I understand why you hate us. You never asked for any of this, and we never gave you a choice. That's what parents do for their children. They do what is best. But now you're an adult. Well, almost 18 in 3 days. My little girl, all grown up." She smiled strangely through the tears. "So now it's up to you. If you don't want the treatment, I won't give it to you. Your choice. But if that's your decision, then you will never leave this room again. You will die here." "Why do you hate me so much?" I finally asked. "Sweetheart, your father and I are the only people in this world who don't hate you," she responded, coldness creeping back into her voice. She stared off into the distance, and her mouth twisted as though she was trying not to be sick. "I remember the way you just tore into that little girl, and her mother was screaming and you looked up with blood all over your face, and you just smiled up at us, so pleased with yourself." She was lost in her own memories and wasn't looking at me, and the hand holding the syringe was limp by her side. It was now or never. Bracing myself against the pain, I wrenched my arm out of the encircling strap and I seized her by the wrist. She squawked in alarm and pulled back, and then that needle was heading towards my eye. I twisted my body away and her momentum carried her forward, and the syringe shattered against the wall. Her throat was inches above my mouth and I could see her pulse hammering away. I could smell her too. She smelled like last night's meal, sweet and nourishing. My hunger surged. My father's poor offering the night before was a pale imitation of the magnificent feast my mother presented me. With each warm, quivering mouthful, I could feel life flooding through my blood and bones, my muscles strengthening and the pain fading from my joints. Strange that a heart as cold and hardened as hers could be so tender against my tongue. I ate quickly, and then I turned to the rest of my restraints. My teeth had sharpened enough by now that I could tear through them with relative ease. And then I got to my feet, marveling at my ability to move freely for the first time in my life, and I stepped out of my prison. I found myself walking down a long hallway, at the end which was a brightly lit room filled with glass tubes and buzzing machines. My father was sitting inside, staring at a small screen. When he looked up and saw me standing there, he rose so quickly that he stumbled into a shelf and fell hard. He didn't even try to struggle as my mother had. Just lay there with the stain spreading across the front of his pants, and he gazed up at me. "Please," he said. "Please." I would have let him go, except I recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look that had been there after he punched me and while he watched me eat the cow heart. No sympathy, no recognition, no love. Fear and hatred. There was never love. There was nothing in the house for me, and the rest of the food that I found was tasteless and did not satisfy my appetite. There wasn't much else besides a number of rooms housing scientific equipment and 2 small bedrooms. I decided not to investigate further, and I burned the whole place to the ground. I'll give them one thing though. My parents built their twisted laboratory far away from any sort of human dwelling. I suppose to keep my suffering a secret from the world. The building was on the edge of a vast pine forest, and the trees had become my refuge for the past few weeks. I sleep on a soft moss, unencumbered by any restraints, and birdsong wakes me up in the morning. The squirrels, rabbits, and occasional deer ensure that I do not starve. But I've been thinking more and more about my long-gone childhood friend and the happiness that I felt with her. The other day, I saw a group of people my age pass by, crashing through trees and laughing with each other. I hid and I watched them. They were so happy and carefree. I wanted friends like that. Besides, I'm getting tired of squirrel. I want to try some birthday cake.